The morning sun was just beginning to warm the streets of Chicago when an old woman stepped off a Greyhound bus at the downtown station. She moved slowly, her back slightly bent from age, and she carried nothing but a small leather bag that looked almost as old as she was. Her gray habit and simple white veil told everyone around her that she was a nun. But what they could not see was the nervous flutter in her chest or the quiet determination in her eyes. Margaret Catherine was 82 years old. She had woken up at 4 that morning in her tiny room at the convent in rural Wisconsin. She had prayed in the dark chapel while the other sisters still slept. And then she had walked half a mile to the bus station in the early cold, bought a one-way ticket, and sat quietly for 3 hours as the bus carried her toward the city dot in her bag. Wrapped carefully in a soft cloth was a photograph. It showed a young woman with bright eyes and a wide smile standing next to a piano. That woman was her mother. She had died just 6 weeks ago, at the age of 103, and Sister Margaret had held her hand as she took her last breath. Now, as she walked through the busy Chicago streets, Sister Margaret could still hear her mother's final words. They had been whispered so softly that she had to lean in close to hear them. "Play for me one more time," her mother had said. "Promise me." And Sister Margaret had promised. She did not know if she could keep that promise. She did not know if her old hands still remembered how. But she had to try. The Millennium Concert Hall stood tall and proud in the heart of the city. Its marble columns and giant glass doors made it look like a palace. Sister Margaret had read about it in a newspaper someone had left at the convent. The hall was hosting an open audition day for a charity concert. Anyone could come and try out. The money raised would go to help homeless people find shelter and food. That was the kind of cause Sister Margaret had devoted her life to. For 60 years, she had served the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. She had scrubbed floors in soup kitchens. She had held the hands of dying men who had no one else. She had prayed for people the world had given up on. But today, she was not here to serve. Today, she was here to play. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the grand lobby. The ceiling rose high above her, decorated with golden lights that sparkled like stars. The floor was polished so bright she could see her own reflection in it. All around her, young people rushed back and forth with instrument cases. Talking excitedly about their auditions, no one paid attention to the old, none standing near the entrance. Sister Margaret took a deep breath and walked toward the registration desk. A young woman sat behind it, typing quickly on a computer. She had perfectly styled hair and a crisp black blazer, and she did not look up when Sister Margaret approached. "Excuse me," Sister Margaret said softly. The young woman kept typing. "One moment, please." Sister Margaret waited. A minute passed. Then 2. Finally, the young woman looked up with a polished smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "How can I help you?" "I would like to audition," Sister Margaret said, "for the charity concert." "On the piano." The young woman blinked. Her smile flickered for just a moment before she caught it and put it back in place. "I'm sorry. Did you say audition?" "Yes. I read that anyone can try out today." The young woman glanced down at Sister Margaret's hands. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, the knuckles slightly swollen. Then she looked at her bent posture, her simple gray habit, her worn leather bag. "That's very sweet," the young woman said in the kind of voice people use when talking to a confused child. "But I think you might be more comfortable watching from the audience. We have some lovely seats available for seniors." Sister Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "I did not come to watch. I came to play." "Ma'am, with all due respect, these auditions are quite competitive. We have people who have trained for years. Professional musicians. I really don't think. I would like to audition," Sister Margaret said again, more firmly this time. The young woman's polite smile finally cracked. She let out a small sigh and picked up a phone on her desk. Security? Yes, I need some assistance at the front desk. We have a situation. Sister Margaret felt her heart sink. A situation. That is what she was now. Not a person. Not a musician. Just a situation to be handled. 2 security guards appeared within moments. They were large men in dark uniforms, and they looked at Sister Margaret the way someone might look at a lost dog that had wandered in from the street. Is there a problem here? One of them asked. This woman is insisting on auditioning, the young woman said. I've tried to explain that it's not really appropriate, but she won't listen. The security guard turned to Sister Margaret. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. Ma'am, maybe it's best if you come with us. We can help you find your way back outside. I do not need help finding my way, Sister Margaret said quietly. I know exactly where I am. I came here to play piano for the audition. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Young musicians with their violin cases and guitar bags stopped to watch. Some of them whispered to each other. A few of them laughed. Look at her, one young man said to his friend. She probably thinks she's at a bingo hall. His friend snickered. Maybe she got lost on the way to church. Sister Margaret heard them. She heard every word, and for a moment she wanted to turn around and walk right back out those glass doors. She wanted to get on the next bus back to Wisconsin, back to her quiet room, back to the safety of her prayers and her silence. But then she thought of her mother, Dot. She thought of the promise she had made, and she thought of all the years she had spent hiding from the world, hiding from the music, hiding from herself. She was 82 years old. She did not have many years left, and she was tired of hiding, Dot, so she stood her ground. I am not lost, she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I am not confused. I am here to audition, just like everyone else, and I would appreciate being treated with the same respect you would give to any other person who walked through those doors. The lobby fell silent. The security guards exchanged uncertain looks. The young woman behind the desk stared at her with wide eyes. The musicians who had been laughing shifted uncomfortably on their feet. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice spoke up. Let her play. Everyone turned to look. An older man stepped forward. He had gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried no instrument, just a cup of coffee and a newspaper tucked under his arm. What's the harm? He said, give the sister 3 minutes. If she can't play, you'll know right away. But if she can... He shrugged. Well, wouldn't that be something? The young woman behind the desk hesitated. She looked at the security guards. She looked at the crowd. She looked at Sister Margaret Dot, and finally, with a heavy sigh, she picked up a clipboard. Fine, she said. 3 minutes. Room B, down the hall on your left. But don't say I didn't warn you. Sister Margaret nodded. She did not smile. She did not thank them. She simply turned and began walking toward the hallway, her worn shoes clicking softly against the polished floor dot behind her. She could hear the whispers starting up again. This is going to be embarrassing. Someone should stop her before she hurts herself. Poor thing. She has no idea what she's getting into. Sister Margaret heard all of it, and she kept walking, because she knew something none of them knew. She knew exactly what she was getting into. She had known it her whole life. The only question now was whether she still had it in her dot, and in 3 minutes, everyone was going to find out. The hallway leading to room B was long and quiet. Sister Margaret walked slowly, her fingers brushing against the cool wall for balance. With each step, memories she had buried for decades began to rise to the surface like bubbles in still water, She had not always been. Sister Margaret Catherine. Once, a long time ago, she had simply been little Maggie Brennan, a skinny girl with messy red hair and freckles on her nose, growing up in a small apartment in Boston. Her father worked at the docks. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families across the city. They had very little money, but they had love and they had music. Her mother had discovered Maggie's gift by accident. One afternoon, when Maggie was just 4 years old, her mother took her along to one of the houses she cleaned. It was a grand home with tall windows and velvet curtains. In the corner of the living room sat a beautiful black piano. While her mother scrubbed the kitchen floors, little Maggie wandered into the living room. She had never seen a piano up close before. She climbed onto the bench, placed her tiny fingers on the keys, and began to play. She played a melody she had heard on the radio that morning. She played it perfectly, note for note, from memory. When the owner of the house came downstairs and saw this small child playing his expensive piano, he did not get angry. He stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth hanging open. Where did she learn to do that? He whispered. Maggie's mother had no answer. Because Maggie had never learned. She had never taken a single lesson, and music simply lived inside her, waiting to come out. That was the day everything changed. The wealthy man paid for Maggie's first piano lessons. He told everyone he knew about the little girl with the magical hands. Word spread quickly. Within a year, Maggie was performing at local concerts. By the time she was 10, she was playing with orchestras. At 14, she stepped onto the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York City and performed in front of 2,000 people. The newspapers called her a miracle, a gift from heaven, a once-in-a-generation talent. Her mother sat in the front row that night at Carnegie Hall, crying tears of joy. After the concert, she held Maggie's face in her hands and said, "You were born for this, my darling. Never forget that." And Maggie never did. At 18, she received a scholarship to study in Vienna, Austria. She trained under one of the greatest piano masters in the world. She practiced 8 hours a day. She learned pieces so difficult that most pianists would never even attempt them. Her teacher said she would become one of the finest musicians of her generation. And then she met him. His name was Thomas. He was a young composer from Ireland, studying in Vienna just like her. He had wild dark hair and a crooked smile and a laugh that could fill a room. He wrote music that made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. They fell in love the way young people do, completely, recklessly, without any thought of tomorrow. Thomas asked her to marry him on a snowy evening in December, beside the frozen Danube River. He got down on one knee in the falling snow and promised to spend the rest of his life writing music for her to play. She said yes. They planned to return to America together. They would get married in Boston, in the little church where Maggie had been baptized. Her mother was already sewing her wedding dress, by hand, stitch by stitch, late into every night. But they never made it to that church. 3 weeks before the wedding, on a dark and rainy night, Thomas was driving them back from a concert in the countryside. The roads were slick. The visibility was poor. A truck came around a blind curve, moving too fast, on the wrong side of the road. Thomas saw it coming. He turned the wheel hard to protect her. He took the full impact. Maggie woke up in a hospital 2 days later. Her right arm was shattered in 3 places. Her collarbone was broken. Her ribs were cracked, but she was alive. Thomas was not. The doctors told her she was lucky. Lucky to survive. Lucky to walk again. But when they looked at her arm, at the damage to her muscles and nerves, they shook their heads. "You may never play the piano again," one of them said gently. "The injury is too severe." "I'm sorry." Maggie did not cry when she heard those words. She did not scream or argue or beg for another answer. She simply turned her face to the wall. and stopped speaking. For 3 months, she lay in that hospital bed and said almost nothing. She refused to eat most days. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, about the life they would never have, about the music that had been stolen from her. When she finally left the hospital, she did not go back to her apartment. She did not return to her music school. She did not call her mother or her friends or anyone from her old life. She walked into a convent on the outskirts of Vienna and asked to stay. The sisters there took her in, without asking questions. They gave her a simple room, a simple bed, and a new name, Margaret Catherine. A name for a new life, a life of prayer and silence and service. She never told them who she had been. She never mentioned the concerts or the fame or the man she had loved. She buried it all so deep inside her that sometimes she almost forgot it herself. Because late at night, when the other sisters were asleep and the convent was dark and silent, she would slip into the small chapel where an old piano sat in the corner. It was nothing like the grand instruments she had played in her youth. The keys were yellowed. Some of the notes stuck. But it was a piano, and she would sit down and play softly, secretly, with tears running down her face. Her arm had healed better than the doctors expected. Her fingers still remembered the music, but she played only for herself, only in the darkness, only when no one could hear. 60 years passed. She moved from the convent in Vienna to one in Wisconsin. She cared for the sick and the dying. She fed the hungry and comforted the lonely. She became known as one of the kindest sisters anyone had ever met. But no one ever knew about the music. No one ever knew about the girl who had played at Carnegie Hall. No one ever knew about the man she had lost or the promise she had broken by hiding herself away. No one except her. Her mother had never stopped hoping. Every time they spoke, every letter, every phone call over the years, her mother would ask the same question. Will you play again someday, Maggie? Will you let the world hear you one more time? And every time, Sister Margaret would change the subject. She would talk about the weather or the garden or the sisters at the convent. Anything to avoid the question. Until 6 weeks ago, her mother was 103 years old when she finally let go. Sister Margaret had traveled to be by her side in those last hours. She held her mother's thin, fragile hand and watched her breathing grow slower and slower. And then, with the last of her strength, her mother opened her eyes. "Play for me," she whispered. "Promise me you will play one more time. Not for the world. For me. Let me hear you from heaven." Sister Margaret had nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise, Mama. I promise." Now, standing outside Room B in the Millennium Concert Hall, she pressed her hand against the door. On the other side was a piano. On the other side was everything she had run from for 60 years. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the accident. She thought of all the pain and loss and silence. And she thought of her mother, watching from somewhere above. She took a deep breath. Then she pushed the door open and walked inside. Room B was smaller than she expected. The walls were plain white, the floor was bare wood, and the only window looked out onto a gray alley behind the building. There were no velvet curtains here, no golden lights, no audience of thousands. Just a piano sat in the center of the room, like it had been waiting for her. A Steinway grand, black and gleaming, its lid propped open to reveal the strings inside. Sister Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it. She had not been this close to a real concert piano in over 60 years. Behind her, she could hear footsteps. People were following her. The young woman from the registration desk appeared first, clipboard in hand, her face tight with impatience. Then came the 2 security guards, standing by the door like they expected trouble. And then, one by one, others began to filter in. young musicians who had been waiting in the lobby, staff members on their break, even a few of the judges who were supposed to be evaluating performers in other rooms. Word had spread quickly through the building. An 82-year-old nun wanted to audition. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. They lined up along the walls, leaning against the doorframe, whispering to each other. Some of them held up their phones, ready to record. Sister Margaret could feel their eyes on her back. She could hear their quiet laughter. "This should be interesting," someone muttered. $5 says she plays Mary Had a Little Lamb." Another voice answered. Sister Margaret ignored them. She walked slowly toward the piano, her worn shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor. Each step felt heavy. Each breath felt tight in her chest. When she reached the bench, she stopped. For a long moment, she just stood there, looking down at the keys. They were so white, so perfect, so familiar, and yet so foreign after all these years. Her hands began to tremble. What was she doing here? She was 82 years old. Her fingers were stiff with age. Her arms still ached sometimes on cold mornings, a reminder of the accident that had nearly ended everything. She had not performed in front of anyone since she was 23 years old. That was 59 years ago, more than half a century. The world had changed completely since then. Music had changed. Audiences had changed. She had changed. Maybe the young woman at the desk was right. Maybe she should have stayed home. Maybe this was all a terrible mistake. She thought about turning around. She thought about walking back through that door, past all those smirking faces, and disappearing into the city. She could catch the next bus back to Wisconsin. She could return to her quiet room, to her prayers, to the safe silence she had lived in for so long. No one would blame her. No one would even remember her name. But then she looked down at her hands, at the thin, wrinkled fingers that had once danced across keyboards all over the world, at the scars on her right arm, faded now but still there, hidden beneath the sleeve of her habit. And she remembered something her mother had told her. A long time ago, before the accident, before Thomas, before everything fell apart. "Fear is not a reason to stop," her mother had said. "Fear is a reason to keep going. Because the things that scare us the most are usually the things that matter the most." Sister Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's face, the way she used to sit in the front row at every concert, no matter how small, no matter how far away. The way she would cry during the slow movements and laugh during the fast ones. The way she would wait backstage afterward with open arms and say the same thing every single time. "That was beautiful, Maggie. You were born for this." A single tear slipped down Sister Margaret's cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and sat down on the bench. The wood was cool and smooth beneath her. The piano loomed before her, massive and magnificent. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys, just resting them there, feeling the ivory beneath her fingertips. The room had gone quiet. No more whispers. No more laughter. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see what she would do. The older man who had spoken up for her in the lobby had followed the crowd. He stood near the back of the room, his coffee cup still in his hand, his kind eyes fixed on her. He gave her a small nod, a silent encouragement. "You can do this." Sister Margaret looked back at the keys. She had not chosen an easy piece. She had not chosen something simple or safe. If this was going to be her last performance, if this was going to be the promise she kept to her mother, then she wanted it to mean something. She had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire. 12 minutes of technical brilliance and emotional depth. Cascading runs that required lightning-fast fingers. Thundering chords that demanded power and precision. Soft passages so delicate they could break your heart. Professional pianists practiced for years before attempting it. Some never mastered it at all. And here she was, an 82-year-old nun who had not touched a concert piano since the Kennedy administration. The young woman with the clipboard cleared her throat. "Whenever you're ready," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes." That was not even enough time to play the first half of the piece. But Sister Margaret was not thinking about time. She was not thinking about the audience, or the skeptics, or the phones, recording her every move. She was thinking about Thomas. She remembered the first time she had played this piece for him, in a small practice room in Vienna. She remembered the way he had sat perfectly still the entire time, barely breathing. She remembered the way he had looked at her when she finished, his eyes shining with tears. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," he had said. "It's like you put your whole soul into the music." And she had. She always had. That was her gift. Not just technical skill, not just speed or precision. It was the ability to feel the music so deeply that it became a part of her, and then to share that feeling with everyone who listened. She had not felt that way in 60 years, but sitting here now, with her fingers on the keys and her mother's face in her mind and Thomas's memory in her heart, she felt something stirring inside her, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The music, it was still there. It had always been there, waiting in the silence, waiting for her to be brave enough to let it out. Sister Margaret took one last breath. She looked up at the ceiling, as if she could see straight through it, straight through the roof and the sky and the clouds, all the way to heaven. "This is for you, Mama," she whispered. "And for you, Thomas. I'm sorry it took me so long." Then she lowered her eyes to the keys. The room held its breath. Sister Margaret began to play. The first note rang out pure and clear, hanging in the air like a single drop of rain before a storm. Then came the second note, and the third, and the fourth, each one flowing into the next like water over stones. The melody was soft at first, gentle, almost hesitant, like a person waking up from a long dream. Sister Margaret's fingers moved slowly, carefully, finding their way back to a language they had not spoken in decades. But with each passing moment, the music grew stronger, and somewhere in the back of the room, the young woman with the clipboard lowered her pen. She had stopped counting the minutes, because something was happening in that small, plain room. Something none of them had expected. Something that would change everything. The old nun was not just playing the piano, she was making it sing. The music started like a whisper, soft and uncertain, like footsteps in fresh snow. The opening notes of Chopin's ballade floated through the small room, delicate as candlelight, fragile as glass. A few people in the crowd shifted on their feet. Someone coughed. One of the young musicians near the door smirked and glanced at his friend, ready to roll his eyes. But then something changed. Sister Margaret's fingers found their rhythm. The hesitation melted away. The notes began to flow faster, smoother, like a river breaking free from ice. Her hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone her age. The music swelled and dipped, rose and fell, carrying with it 60 years of silence, 60 years of sorrow, 60 years of love that had been locked away in the dark. The smirk faded from the young musician's face. He lowered his phone, because this was not what he expected. This was not what any of them expected. This was not an old woman fumbling through a simple tune. This was something else entirely. This was mastery. The melody grew more complex. Sister Margaret's left hand rolled through deep, rumbling bass notes, while her right hand danced through intricate patterns high on the keyboard. Her fingers stretched and leaped, moving with a speed and precision that made no sense. How could hands so old move so fast? How could fingers so warm create sounds so pure? The young woman with the clipboard had forgotten she was holding it. Her mouth hung slightly open. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, on the old nun bent over the keys, on the miracle unfolding before her. In the hallway outside, people stopped walking. They stood frozen, turning their heads toward the sound. More of them gathered at the doorway, crowding together, pushing forward to see what was happening inside Room B. The music filled the air like perfume. It spilled out of the room and floated through the corridors of the concert hall. It reached the lobby, where the registration desk sat empty, because even the staff had wandered away to find the source of the sound. It drifted up the stairs and into the main auditorium, where a group of judges sat reviewing their notes. One by one, they looked up from their papers. One by one, they set down their pens. And still, Sister Margaret played. She played like she was alone in the world, like there was no audience, no room, no building around her. Her eyes were closed. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm. Her lips moved silently, whispering words no one could hear. She was not performing for the crowd. She was performing for the people who could not be there. For Thomas, who had loved this piece, who had sat beside her on piano benches in Vienna and turned pages for her while she practiced, who had promised to spend his life writing music for her to play, before that promise was stolen by a rainy road and a truck that came too fast, for her mother, who had believed in her from the very beginning, who had scrubbed floors so her daughter could have lessons, who had sewn a wedding dress that was never warm, who had waited 60 years for this moment, and who was surely watching now from somewhere beyond the clouds. The music reached its middle section. The tempo slowed. The thundering chords gave way to something softer, something achingly tender. It was the part of the piece that always made Thomas cry, the part that sounded like grief and hope tangled together, like saying goodbye and hello at the same time. Sister Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall onto her habit, onto her hands, onto the keys themselves. In the audience, she was not the only one crying. The young woman with the clipboard had tears running down her face. She did not know why. She had never been moved by classical music before. She had never cared much about pianos or old composers or any of it. But something about this performance was different. Something about the way this old nun played reached inside her chest and grabbed hold of her heart. The older man who had defended Sister Margaret in the lobby stood near the back of the room. His coffee cup had gone cold in his hand. His glasses were foggy with emotion. He was a retired music teacher. He had spent 40 years listening to students play. He had heard thousands of performances, some brilliant, some terrible, most somewhere in between. But he had never heard anything like this. This was not just skill. This was not just talent. This was something deeper, something spiritual. It was as if the old nun had opened a door to another world. And the music pouring through was not entirely of this earth. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and kept watching. The piece built toward its climax. The tempo quickened again. The notes came faster and faster, tumbling over each other like water rushing toward a waterfall. Sister Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard, striking chords that shook the walls, spinning out melodies that twisted and soared. Her body leaned into the piano. Her shoulders rose and fell with the rhythm. Every muscle, every bone, every breath was part of the music now. She was not playing the piano anymore. She had become the piano. The final section arrived. The most difficult part. The part that separated the good pianists from the great ones. Cascading runs that required fingers to move faster than thought. Octave jumps that demanded perfect accuracy. A storm of sound building toward one final devastating release. Sister Margaret did not slow down. She did not hesitate. She attacked the keys with a ferocity that made people gasp. Her wrinkled hands became a blur. The piano sang and screamed and wept beneath her touch. And then at last came the ending. 3 massive chords, struck with all the power she had left. They rang out like church bells, like thunder, like the final word in a conversation that had lasted a lifetime. The last chord faded into silence. Sister Margaret's hands lifted slowly from the keys. Her shoulders dropped. Her head bowed forward until her chin nearly touched her chest. The room was completely still, Dot. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. For a long moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that comes after something sacred. The kind of silence that feels like the whole world has paused to pay respect. Then Sister Margaret lifted her head. She looked up at the ceiling, her eyes still wet with tears. And she smiled. "That was for you, Mama," she whispered. "I hope you heard me." She did not know that 30 phones had recorded every second of her performance. She did not know that one of those recordings would be uploaded to the internet that very evening. She did not know that by tomorrow morning, millions of people around the world would watch and not. 82-year-old nuns sit down at a piano and break their hearts. All she knew was that she had kept her promise, Dot, and then the room exploded. Dot, it started with 1 person clapping, then 2, then 10, then everyone. The applause crashed through the small room like a wave. People cheered. People shouted. People stamped their feet on the wooden floor. The young woman with the clipboard was sobbing openly now, clapping so hard her palms hurt. The security guards who had wanted to escort Sister Margaret out were wiping their eyes. The young musicians who had laughed at her were standing in stunned silence, their phones forgotten in their hands. The older man pushed through the crowd and walked straight to the piano. He stood in front of Sister Margaret and bowed his head. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in my life," he said, his voice cracking. "Who are you? Where did you learn to play like that?" Sister Margaret looked at him with tired, peaceful eyes. "I am just an old nun from Wisconsin," she said softly. "I used to play a long time ago, before the world forgot about me, before I forgot about myself." She placed her hand over her heart. But the music never forgot. It waited for me. All these years, it waited. She smiled again, and this time there was no sadness in it. And tonight, I finally let it out. That night, while Sister Margaret slept on a small cot in a church hostel near the bus station, the world was waking up to her story. A young staff member from the concert hall had uploaded her video with a simple caption. An 82-year-old nun was told she couldn't audition. Then she sat down at the piano. Within an hour, the video had 1,000 views. By midnight, it had 100,000. By sunrise, it had crossed 2 million. People shared it with their friends. Their friends shared it with their families. News websites picked it up. Television stations ran it on their morning shows. By the time Sister Margaret finished her morning prayers and stepped outside into the cold Chicago air, she had become the most talked about person on the internet. She had no idea. She did not own a phone. She did not watch television. She had planned to catch the early bus back to Wisconsin and return to her quiet life at the convent, where no one would ever know what she had done. But when she arrived at the bus station, something strange happened. A woman in a business suit stopped in front of her and stared. Then she smiled, reached out, and took Sister Margaret's hand. "It's you," the woman said, her eyes filling with tears. "I watched your video this morning. I cried for 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late." Before Sister Margaret could respond, another person approached. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around her. People were taking photos. People were asking for her blessing. A little girl tugged on her habit and asked if she could teach her to play piano. Sister Margaret stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed and confused. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "What video? What are you all talking about?" A kind stranger showed her. He held up his phone and played the recording from the night before. Sister Margaret watched herself sit down at the piano. She watched her own hands begin to move. She listened to the music fill the small room on the tiny screen. And she understood. The world had found her. After 60 years of hiding. 60 years of silence, 60 years of believing that her story was over. The world had found her again. Within days. Everything changed. The organizers of the charity concert reached out to her. They did not want her to audition anymore. They wanted her to be the star of the show, the headlining act, the main event. They offered to fly her back to Chicago first class, put her up in a fancy hotel, and give her whatever she needed. Sister Margaret said no to the first-class ticket. She said no to the fancy hotel. But she said yes to the concert. "I will play," she told them, "but not for fame, not for myself. I will play for the people this concert is meant to help. The homeless, the hungry, the forgotten. They are the ones who matter." The night of the concert arrived 3 weeks later. The Millennium Concert Hall was packed. Every seat was filled. People had flown in from across the country to be there. Television cameras lined the back of the auditorium. Reporters waited in the lobby with their microphones and notebooks. But backstage, in a small dressing room, Sister Margaret sat alone. She held the photograph of her mother in her hands. The same photograph she had carried on the bus that first day. The same photograph that had given her the courage to walk through those glass doors. "I wish you could be here, Mama," she whispered. "I wish you could see this." She closed her eyes and pressed the photograph to her heart. A soft knock came at the door. It was time. Sister Margaret walked onto the stage to a standing ovation. 2,000 people rose to their feet before she had even played a single note. The applause washed over her like warm rain. She stood there for a moment, looking out at all those faces, all those strangers who had come to hear her play. She thought about the little girl she used to be, the skinny kid with messy red hair who had climbed onto a piano bench in a stranger's living room and discovered that music lived inside her. She thought about all the stages she had played on since then. Carnegie Hall, concert halls in Vienna, grand theaters across Europe, but none of them had felt like this. This felt like coming home. She sat down at the piano, the same Steinway she had played weeks before. The crowd fell silent. The cameras focused. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, and Sister Margaret began to play. She played for nearly an hour that night. She played Chopin and Beethoven and Debussy. She played pieces she had not touched in decades, and she played them perfectly. Her fingers moved like they belonged to a young woman again. The music poured out of her like water from a spring that had been blocked for too long. When she finally played her last note, the audience did not just applaud. They wept. The concert raised more money than any charity event in the hall's history. Enough to build 3 new homeless shelters. Enough to feed thousands of families for an entire year. Enough to change lives. But Sister Margaret did not stay to celebrate. She thanked the organizers. She blessed the audience. And then she quietly slipped out the back door, climbed into a waiting car, and returned to Wisconsin. Over the following year, she performed 3 more times. Once at a church in Boston, where she had grown up. Once at a hospital benefit, playing for children who were fighting terrible illnesses. And once at a small concert hall in Vienna, in the city where she had fallen in love and lost everything. Each time, she donated every cent to charity. Each time, she refused interviews, photographs, and fame. Each time, she played her heart out and then disappeared back into the quiet life she had chosen. Reporters tried to track her down. They wanted to know her whole story. They wanted to write books and make movies and turn her into a legend. But Sister Margaret was not interested in being a legend, Dot. She was interested in being a piece, Dot, and finally, she was Dot 2 years after that first audition. On a cold winter morning, much like the one when she had boarded that bus to Chicago, Sister Margaret passed away in her sleep. She was 84 years old. She died in her tiny room at the convent, surrounded by the sisters who had become her family. On her nightstand, they found the photograph of her mother. It was worn now, the edges soft from being held so many times. On the back, in Sister Margaret's shaky handwriting, were 2 words, "Promise kept." The news of her death spread quickly. People around the world mourned her. They shared her video again. They lit candles in her memory. They played her recordings and remembered the old nun who had walked into a concert hall and reminded everyone that it is never too late to share your gift with the world. Dot at her funeral. The little chapel was filled with flowers. Sisters from convents across the country came to pay their respects. And in the corner, an old piano sat silent, draped in white cloth. But just before the service ended, something unexpected happened. A young woman stood up from the back pew. She was one of the orphans Sister Margaret had helped feed at a soup kitchen years ago. She walked slowly to the piano, lifted the cloth, and sat down. She placed her small hands on the keys, and she began to play. Dot. It was not perfect. It was not masterful, but it was beautiful. It was full of love and gratitude and hope, because that was Sister Margaret's true gift. Not just the music she made, but the music she inspired in others, the courage to try, the faith to believe, and the grace to share what is inside you. No matter how long you have kept it hidden, her story did not end when she died. It was only just beginning.